Hello. A warm welcome to all of you on today's event. This is Manoj Kulwal. I am your host for the event today. And today's topic is good and bad practices for risk and control monitoring. And this topic will be covered by our expert speaker, Mike Finley. Mike has over 30 years of experience in banking and finance. The majority of his career, he's focused on risk, specifically in the middle and back office environments. Mike led the development of the KRI framework underlying the KRIEX.org KRI library, which we're going to briefly talk about in the session today. He's also been involved in development of operational risk loss data consortiums for several national and regional banking associations and consortium. So welcome, Mike, in today's session. Before I hand over the floor to Mike, I want to just give you a brief introduction to IOR and its activities, as some of you may be new to IOR, may not be aware on what IOR does. So IOR is basically a global member-based organization. It's run by the operational risk professionals for the operational risk professionals, and its sole mission is to promote the development of the operational risk discipline. It does that by developing and sharing practical guidance with practitioners. This is primarily done through documents known as sound practice guidance, which are available on 10 key operational risk topics like risk assessments, loss data, and key risk indicators. And key risk indicator is, in fact, one of the most used sound practice guidance document IOR has published for its members. IOR also undertakes research on emerging topics and then shares the output of those research with the members and the wider operational risk community. IOR also organizes and delivers events. So some of the events are physical face-to-face events, which are organized by the various chapters around the world. And then we also organize online events like the one you're attending today. IOR has also started to get involved in development of independent professional certifications over the last 12 months. And as this is a new activity, I want to briefly give a small overview on this particular activity. So particularly, there is a certification called Certificate of Operational Risk Management, which was launched by IOR in May 2017. This certification is targeted for two types of professionals. So first, operational risk is still a growing discipline. So there are a lot of individuals from other disciplines like compliance, audit, legal, who may be joining operational risk. So the certification is targeted for those type of individuals who are new to operational risk and they want to get a good foundation in terms of the operational risk concepts, and then have an independent certification to demonstrate that they understand the foundational concepts of operational risk. It is also targeted for organizations who need to demonstrate to their stakeholders, such as regulators or internal auditors or board, that various individuals in the organization who are involved in operational risk management role understand the foundation concepts of operational risk management. So those are sort of the two broad business issues the certification tries to address. The certification is accredited by ATHE, which is regulated by Ofqual. So it's not just something issued by IOR. It's an independent certification. It went through a rigorous due diligence process where all the processes, the exam questions, the course content, everything was evaluated by independent examiners before the certificate was issued. And it is equivalent to a level 4 accreditation, which is equivalent to a pre-foundation level degree course. And in EU, it's equivalent to a EQF level 5. It's a self-study exam. It's a self-study exam where once you register, the fee is £550 plus VAT. And once you register, you get the course workbook, which covers topics highlighted here. So these are the 9 sort of chapters which are covered within the workbook. So you can study the workbook, and then once you're comfortable with the content, then you can appear for the online exam. And then if you pass the exam, then you get the certification. you get the certification to demonstrate that you understand the foundation concepts of operational risk management. So there are more details available on the IOR website in case you or any of your team members may be interested in this new certification. Coming back to today's session, so we'll give the floor to Mike for about 40 minutes, where he'll give us some best practices and guidance around risk and control monitoring. And what I will do is I will keep asking questions on your behalf during the session. So if you have any questions, then please post your questions in the chat window, and then I'll keep an eye on your questions, and then I'll ask those questions to Mike at the appropriate time. So we'll make it into a discussion format where I'll have the discussion with Mike, but then we'll also leave some time in the end for any questions I may have, or you all may have towards the end. And the slides and the recording of the session will be made available to IOR members in the membership area. So if you are not a IOR member, I strongly recommend that you consider becoming an IOR member, because you can get access to a lot of good operational risk content and an opportunity to meet fellow operational risk professionals at different events organized by IOR. So with that, let me hand over the floor to Mike. So let me make you the presenter, Mike, and you should be able to share your screen with us. Perfect. Yeah. So we see your screen, Mike. Over to you.
Good. Thanks, Manoj. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's session. As is customary with this kind of thing, a very quick disclaimer. I'm not liable for anything I say. If you follow anything that I say and do anything I say, good luck to you. That's your decision and your decision only. With that out the way, let's go and discuss this topic that we have today. So I'm putting up a slide here. What is a KRI? What is a key risk indicator? What is an indicator? What are we actually talking about? Now, if you've been around the conference circuit for a couple of conferences, if you've picked up a couple of textbooks on operational risk, you'll have probably read a lot of myth, a lot of legends, a lot of theory. And interestingly enough, you know, we're sitting in 2017. The initial consultative papers on operational risk put out by the Bank for International Settlements came out in the late 1990s. So, you know, this is a topic that has been with us for nigh on 20 odd years. And over those 20 years, I think key risk indicators have been the one topic that have probably confounded more people and confused more people, and being the subject of more failed initiatives within firms than anything else in the area of operational risk. So what is this? What are these things? You know, what can we use them for? Why do they go wrong? Essentially, a KRI is whatever you want it to be. People talk about the top 10 KRIs. They talk about predictive KRIs. They talk about all these kind of things, and it means something different to absolutely every single person. If you break it down, though, all that it really is a piece of data. So if we're talking about staff turnover, it's a annualized percentage of turnover. If we're talking about number of staff errors, it is either the absolute number of errors within a given time period or an average number of errors within a given time period. It's a piece of data. The most critical thing about these is we need to understand who has to use the data and what do they need to use it for. Because it's only those people who really need the data that will have any value in that. So too often what we do is we create a concept, and we'll say, right, if your job is managing operations, you need to have a KRI telling you how many errors have occurred in your processes. Well, the problem is, any supervisor or manager worth their salt knows exactly how many errors their people are making without needing to monitor some sort of metric on a formalized basis. That's not the information they need. It doesn't have any value for them. Generically, you know, it's like if you think of a motor vehicle. If you're driving a motor vehicle and you look down at your dashboard, and if your fuel gauge, your gas gauge is reading empty, well, that tells you what your exposure is. It tells you that you're not going to go much further unless you put some fuel, some gas in the tank. And that's exactly the same with the KRI. At a particular point in time, it has some measure, some value to it, and that gives rise or a measure of some form of exposure that we have at that particular point in time. By tomorrow, it has a totally different view, has a totally different feeling. And so what we need to do is to monitor these on an ongoing basis. But perhaps one of the biggest myths that we have is that there are these things called KRIs, KPIs, KCIs. I've even heard of KTIs for key trouble indicators. Call them whatever you want. In my mind, there's absolutely no difference between any of them. And let me give you an example. If we've got a trading operation and the one metric that we have is the number of transactions on which we have outstanding confirmations with the counterparties with whom we did those transactions. So I may know that we've had 100 transactions that were executed today. At this particular point in time, 15 of them have not yet been confirmed. The question is this a risk indicator? Is it a performance indicator? Is it a control effectiveness indicator? What is it? The answer to it really, if you stop and think about it, it comes back to who is using or who needs that information. And this is where the value question comes back to it. So if I am the person responsible for the confirmation process, I'm in that administrative type function, I am a control function, and I am told that there are 15 outstanding confirmations. Is this, for me, a risk indicator? And the answer is no, it's not a risk. We've identified 15 transactions that there are problems with. So there's no risk in that to me in my function. Is it a performance metric? Well, arguably, there is a measure of performance in there in that I've caught 15 out of 100. But it's not really telling me anything about my performance overall within the cycle of the transactional flow. Is it a control effectiveness indicator or KCI? And the answer here is absolutely. We have actually found something where there are 15 items that have issues with it. So my control has worked. I'm a control function. I've identified the 15 problems. So to me, it's a KCI. We go back upstream and go to the dealing room and walk in and say to the traders, there are 15 transactions that we cannot confirm. Well, apart from the normal sort of so what response that you get out of them, we come back to our old question. Is this a risk indicator? Well, no, they've concluded the transactions. Hopefully they've hedged any open positions. So to them, there is no risk. Is it a control metric? No, because it's not a control on them. It's a downstream control to them. Is it a performance metric? Well, potentially, because what it's saying is out of the 100 transactions that we executed, 15 of them have problems. So potentially we as the traders either made errors in recording them, or our instructions weren't clear, or there was some degree of ambiguity in what we actually did. So to us, it is potentially a KPI. So we go down into the bowels of the organization and we find the poor people responsible for settlements and payments. And we say to them, there are 15 transactions coming down the pipe to you on which there are errors. And we ask ourselves a question, is this a performance measure? No, because it's not got to us. Is it a control measure? No, because it's not got to us. Is it a risk measure? Well, possibly, because in that case, if the issues are not resolved, we may not be able to settle, we may be faced with interest claims, etc. So depending on who we are, this one piece of data has changed in what it actually represents significantly, and as a consequence, they will be looked at differently, but it's still the same piece of data. So another question that people often ask is who owns indicators? Is this something that is owned by the risk function? Is it owned by the business? And if you throw the so-called 3 lines of defense or 3 lines of accountability into it, it becomes even more muddied who owns these things. So a few things to consider. Who decides which indicators to monitor? Is this something that is dreamt up by risk or by audit or by compliance? Or is it something that is developed by the risk owners, the control owners, who have concerns about things and as a consequence of that decide that they wish to actually monitor these particular items? Who decides how we calculate the values? So if we have something called staff turnover, is this full-time employees? Is it part-time employees? Does it include contractors? Does it exclude contractors? Is it an annualized turnover? Is it a monthly turnover? Somebody, some forum has to agree how we calculate these things. Otherwise, it's impossible for us to compare them across the organization. Who receives indicator reports? When do they get them? Are these things that are put onto a piece of paper and sent out to every single manager? Are they restricted to only a few people? I would argue that anyone who has a need for risk and control related information should be receiving these reports. Same thing with escalation. We have levels of accountability. We have delegations of authority. If our authority or our accountability is being challenged, we have to escalate. That's whether it's a credit decision, a risk decision, any decision. And so KRIs and other forms of metrics should be subject to exactly the same sort of structure. If it's challenging our delegated authority, then we escalate it. And just another thing to think about, when do we discontinue these things and who decides we should? Because not all metrics remain in place forever and in use forever. So what might be a bit useful for you is to understand the different roles in the indicator process. Because in my mind, this is where most KRI programs go horribly wrong, by not understanding the discrete roles and who is responsible for what in this process. So to start off with, we have what I call data providers. This is a person who understands the context of what it is that they're actually delivering to you. So in this case here, in this particular example, they understand that it is a double burger with all the trimmings, blue cheese, bacon, etc., etc. The provider delivers that to a particular consumer. The consumer has decided what it is that they want. They've decided how much of it they want. They've decided how regularly they want it. The provider's job is to ensure that the consumer gets it at the point in time that they need it. Now here is where most programs go wrong. We tend to treat the provider and the consumer as the same person. So think about it. You have a risk and control self-assessment. In your assessment of a particular unit, they identify that they have a big exposure to, let's say, incorrect data. So what do? We say, right, you need to monitor a metric that says how many times do you have bad data. That is not actually the problem for these guys. The problem is the data they are receiving is incorrect. So what they need is a metric from upstream, from where the data is originating, that gives them some sort of insight as to the likelihood that the data they receive is out of date, incomplete, inappropriate, bad, etc., etc. So we should be putting the metric on the provider so that the consumer gets the right information, not confusing the two roles or treating them as one and the same. Then in addition to the consumer, we also have what I would term interested onlookers. So these are people who have an interest in what is going on, but they are not the primary consumer. They're not the primary group of people who need to have the information to make business decisions on. But in the event that the consumer can no longer eat any more burgers, escalation occurs, and typically one of the observers steps in to become the consumer. So that's how your escalation process kicks in. Now, another problem that we often have in the process is that behind the provider are the producers, the people who actually have the data. Now, as you'll see in this example, the person on the left is simply flipping burger patties. They don't know whether that's going to go into a double cheeseburger, whether that's going to be served up on a brioche bun, whether it's going to be served up, chopped into pieces as part of some other elaborate production. All they know is they are producing individual pieces. Too often what we do is we go directly to the producer. And this normally happens where you go to a data warehouse and you say to them, give me a piece of data that is called X. What they will do is they'll look through their data dictionary, they'll find the first piece of data that's called X, and that's what they'll give to you, without any understanding as to the context of the data, what that data really represents or means, or even without any sort of insight as to exactly what the data is derived from. So beware going directly to the producers. Leave it to the provider who understands the context to actually put it into the right perspective for you. And then lastly, let's not forget very critically the fact that we also have risk management compliance sitting in the picture as well. So their job is making sure the environment is fit for purpose. It's their job ensuring that the quality that we're receiving in terms of metrics is appropriate and that people are actually monitoring and delivering these things as and when they need to. So I think if you take this slide and you recognize these 5 roles and you actually use these 5 roles to better understand the picture and the environment that you're operating in, it will help you considerably in streamlining and clarifying some of the mysterious aspects of a KRI program. So let's come back to our primary topic. Which risks, which controls should we be monitoring? Now, if I could actually have the luxury of having had a bar of gold for every time I had been asked this question, probably be a part owner of Fort Knox by now, because it's a question that really dogs a lot of people. And one of the reasons for that is that there are a lot of answers. Pick up a textbook, go and ask somebody who lives in the academic or theoretical world, and they'll tell you all risks, all controls should be monitored. Now, that's quite difficult, because I think, as we all know, some risks are considered a bit more critical, a bit more serious than others. Some controls are considered more important or more key than others. So do we treat all of these things equally? Where we have a control process or where we have a suite of controls in place against a risk, do we have to have metrics on each one of those, or do we put metrics on the overall suite of controls? So this academic answer doesn't really help us that much. So what else can we do? Well, we can turn to regulatory guidance. And as always, it comes with 25 different caveats. And basically, they'll say, well, whichever ones you think are important, and by the way, if you monitor ones that you think are important and leave out ones that we think are important, we'll probably hit you with a sanction or a fine of some sort. So not much of a help there. So what do risk practitioners say? Well, risk practitioners would then simply say, well, you need to monitor your key risks, your key controls. And now we start running into a bit of a nightmare, because essentially, from a business perspective, they want to monitor as few as possible because they've got too many other things to do, and all this risk stuff is garbage, and doesn't really help them because we're not adding value to them. So if you're going to make me monitor my key risks and key controls, then there's a likelihood that when I come to do my risk and control assessments, I'm not going to have very many key risks and many key controls, because that way I don't have to have too many KRIs in place. So bear in mind, we create a bit of a problem for ourselves in trying to use these sort of structures. We need to take into account who the provider is, who the consumer is, and what information do they really need to be monitoring. So,
Mike, can I ask a question
sure.
at this stage? Yeah. So, by the way, I liked that diagram you have on the previous slide. I think that does provide a good clarity, on the different roles, and I can see why the provider and the consumer, sort of generally gets confused. But my question is around, when we say key risk indicators, I think there are 2 interpretations. So it'd be good to hear from you, what is the most common interpretation that when organizations say we monitor key risk indicators, what do they mean? So the first interpretation could be that you have 100 risks, but out of 100 risks, there are 10 key risks. So we only have indicators against those 10 key risks. Could be one approach. That you call those indicators as key risk indicators. Or another approach could be you have your risks, but against those risks, you can monitor lots of different types of indicators. But of course, you don't have time and resources to monitor all the type of indicators. So you pick 2 or 3 key indicators against each risk. In which case, you may then be monitoring key indicators against lots of risks in comparison to the first approach where you have key risks and then you're monitoring the relevant indicators for that. So what's the common interpretation you've seen in your experience? That which of those two do organizations mean when they say we monitor KRIs?
Excellent question, Manoj. The answer is both of them.
Okay.
Yes, different organizations think about them differently, but both of those scenarios that you've just portrayed are very commonly used. And unfortunately, both of them are often one of the causes for KRI programs becoming devalued and in many cases over time actually discontinued. The problem that we have, and this is something that is not just confined to key risk indicators, but it is relatively a generic issue with operational risk management per se, is that when we look at data of this nature, it is incredibly lagging data. So if I look at the number of errors made by my staff last month, by the time I get that data, if I'm lucky, we're already 10 days, 15 days into the following month. So the fact that I've got little Johnny who over the last 3 months has doubled the number of errors each month and is now accounting for 70% of my total errors in a given process. By the time I get that information and I can actually understand the trend of what I'm actually looking at, I'm well into my 4th month, if not my 5th month, and by then we've really been hurt by his activities. Worse than that, in many cases, what we consider to be our key risk, or which are the most significant of a suite of risks, may not actually represent our true risks. So we all know about our black swans and these sort of unknown unknowns. Operational risk is all about people risk. It's all about what our people do, what our people don't do, what our people do which they shouldn't be doing. So often we don't even have metrics around that. If we do, the metrics that we have, by definition, being a metric, is very regimented, it's very strict. It's telling me something at a particular point in time. So if my metric is saying to me number of staff who have entered the premises after hours, by the time I actually interpret that and say, well, when are they doing it? Is there a particular trend here? It's every 3rd Saturday between the hours of 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. Before I can actually sort of make sense of that, typically the risk has already hit us, manifested itself in some form of loss or some particular problem that we've got to deal with. So worse than just monitoring it on the worst risks or having the best indicators to measure a portfolio of risks, the problem we have is we often have metrics that are not measuring anything, or we have risks that we don't have any metrics on because we don't know their risks. And this sort of whole thing sort of clouds the whole particular picture. And that actually leads me quite nicely into my very next point, which is, how many indicators do we really need? Yep. And there's no answer to this. It depends. You get 2 forms of metrics that most firms sort of monitor. They're the so-called top-down and the so-called bottom-up ones. The top-down ones, I can remember 20 years ago going to a conference and having somebody stand up and saying, well, what are the top 10 KRIs that every firm should monitor and every firm should report to its board? Well, there's no such thing. First of all, I cannot think of 10 specific metrics that every part of the organization can measure equally and that you can compare consistently across the organization. Secondly, every firm has a different strategy, has a different structure, has a different mission. And so therefore, there's not one size fits all, and you can use the same 10 metrics for everyone. So the reality is, in terms of top-down metrics, is a very, very limited set that applies across the entire organization. There are a few more that you can apply division by division or business area by business area. By far, the majority of metrics are bottom-up ones. That is, metrics that business need to monitor to give them an idea of what their exposures are, and that when they trigger escalation structures get reported upwards. So from that sort of perspective, you can't put a number to that, because a unit might have 10, another unit may have 100, another unit may have 1,000. Who knows? To give you one example, there's an organization, a European retail banking organization, that track on a daily basis 28 discrete metrics within every branch operation they have. So, that gives them one particular perspective on how well each branch stacks up against another branch from a risk perspective. If you move beyond that, they then have weekly, monthly, quarterly metrics on top of that as well. So, very, very quickly, you're going to be up into a couple of 100 metrics that that particular organization is monitoring. Some trading and sales or global markets type organizations that I know have well into the 200 and 300 metrics that they track across a diverse portfolio of products. So there's no clear answer as to how many metrics we should have. To me, the answer is quite simple. As many as you can have without causing business disruption. And again, I come back to this particular point. As operational risk practitioners, as compliance professionals, even the third line audit professionals, we like to say the business must report to all of these things without recognizing the fact that we don't always provide them with the tools to actually track the data, and so therefore be able to report on it without disrupting their day-to-day activities or forcing them to obtain more headcount in an area where they have budget constraints anyway. Now, a point that I do want to touch on here, I've put up here, look out for what I'm terming automatic indicators. And I'm not here referring to things that are generated automatically by systems. What I'm really referring to here is the fact that we have numerous other forms of data that simply by thinking about them slightly differently actually form metrics in their own right. So number of open audit findings, number of open compliance findings, number of customer complaints, number of operational risk losses broken down by loss event type or by risk category, broken down by business line, broken down by product area, number of remedial actions against losses. All of these are data that we as operational risk and compliance professionals should have at our fingertips, because it is other data that we are collecting. So let's come back to which risks and controls we should be monitoring. Let's take the complete set of risk assessments across the business. We should have a metric that says number of risks rated above, whatever shade of red you wish to put them on. Number of risks rated red that are considered beyond risk appetite. Number of controls that are manually monitored that are deemed to be ineffective. All of these generate good metrics for us and allow us to actually link the exposures that the business see to the metrics that people are then reporting on, bearing in mind the difference between the consumer and the provider that we actually have. A critical point on this. Now, another view on this use of automatic metrics that I just want to touch on here quickly. Beware when you start collecting KRIs. There are many different ways of getting it. You can take them out of systems. You can have people derive them using spreadsheets. You can have metrics where you collect two pieces of data, which then allows you to calculate a third piece. You can have people manually inputting these into a system. There are a whole host of different ways in which you can actually get this data together. I have seen many, many firms who have built the most elaborate indicator monitoring systems possible and then failed when they realized the volume of data that has to be obtained to feed the machine. So, in today's world of, big data analytics platforms, so, you talk about things like IBM's Watson product and some of those sort of products. These things can generate all sorts of risk intelligence for you, but have to be linked into virtually every single transactional system, every support system, every remedial workflow system that you actually have. So while your definition of your KRI program may be relatively cheap from a cost perspective, by the time you link in every single possible system you need to have in place, you suddenly find yourself in, the millions and millions of dollars, euros, pounds, yen type price frames. So, just bear that one in mind. It's a bit of an issue that you need to think of as you go through the program. Right,
so
moving on.
On the previous slide, Mike, I have a couple of questions there for you. So there, I think the branch example you highlighted is something I am starting to see organizations use, where there are those two approaches that you either look at a specific risk. For example, you look at the mis-selling of product risk, and then you identify what could be some of the key indicators which can tell us that there is the likelihood or the impact of that particular risk is changing. So in that case, you're capturing indicators, but in context of a specific risk. And because that can add up in terms of the number of indicators very quickly, if you then start monitoring 15, 20, 30 risks, you can easily get into hundreds of indicators. The other approach, I think, which you highlighted is also I've seen organizations start to use, where they're not necessarily going down to individual risk level, but they just take a department or a branch or a business unit, and then they identify 15, 20 very high-level indicators which tell you more about the overall risk and control environment, but they don't necessarily tell you that the risk of fraud may be going up or the risk of mis-selling may be going up, but it gives you a little bit more higher picture about the department or that business unit. So is that something also you're starting to see more, because you then are tracking less indicators? So you're tracking 15 to 20 indicators for the whole branch or for the whole department, and then if you track those same 15, 20 indicators across different departments, then you can benchmark and see what's going on. But it's still a very high-level information. It may not give you the level of detail that things may be changing in terms of risk exposure at a certain risk level. So I can see why that high-level approach is what organizations are going for to start with. That it's at least better that if you're not able to do the granular approach, then go with that high-level approach. Are you starting to see more organizations go with that approach instead of let's go look at our top 20, top 30 risks and then define indicators against each risk?
I think it's it's to do with where the firm is on its maturity curve. The approach to focus on existing identified risks works on the premise that the business know what all their risks actually are. And typically, you only become aware of a risk once it's already affected you or it's affected other organizations that you monitor or track. It doesn't help you with the risks that have not yet manifested themselves or which you are not yet aware of. So, take something like ransomware, or take something like the Bangladesh Bank cyber heist, where, techniques were used that people were not familiar with, and hence suddenly everyone's running around madly saying, oh, we've got this risk, how do we address it? If you use a metric that is more around measuring the climate, and I'm using the term there in inverted commas, of a particular unit. And basically what you're doing is you're creating a basket of metrics that links in things like customer complaint levels, it's linking in staff complaint levels, staff satisfaction levels, sales target versus budget, the percentage sales in new or complex product areas, error rates, staff attrition rates. So you take a basket like that. That often gives you a feeling for the particular culture within a particular unit and how well that unit is working or functioning compared to its peers. Now, if you're a Wells Fargo, and my apologies if anyone from Wells Fargo is on the line, where you've got a systemic problem across multiple areas, obviously even a basket type approach is not going to flush those out. But if you do have particular areas where there are issues arising, then a basket type structure will help you identify those compared to others without focusing on individual risks.
Okay. So the way I'm interpreting that is that from a maturity perspective, if you're starting out, it may be easier and effective to start out with, I like the word climate, that have 10 or 15 indicators for a department or a business unit level, which gives you indication on if there are some issues you may have to drill down into, that maybe start with that, because it's less indicators, you get a slightly higher view, and then only once you get you are comfortable with that, then maybe drill down to the individual risk level, because the level of indicators and the granularity and all that will increase significantly once you start going down risk 1, risk 2, risk 3, and start assigning indicators against those.
Yeah, absolutely. And by using basket structures, what you can do is at intermediate levels of management, you can have individual people focusing on different elements within the basket. And then what you do is you then at a more senior level, you're sort of extracting or aggregating the data further until you come up to 1 or 2 metrics at the higher levels. And then by using techniques like percent ranking them and things like that, you can get your top 10, your bottom 10. You can look at the delta of which ones have moved the most over the last day, last week, last month, and get all sorts of sort of techniques like that to actually focus in on real critical areas.
Right. Okay. No, so that's good guidance. Thank you.
So I want to move on and just talk a bit about sort of leading and lagging metrics. And the first thing that I just want to make everyone absolutely clear about, that in my book there's no such thing as a predictive metric. Indicators are historical data. Number of staff that have left us, number of losses we've had, number of errors we've had, number of transactions with problems. If you've got a metric that is attempting to be predictive, have the margins landed? It's no. It's like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. The moment it goes on, no, yes, splat, it's too late. The problem's already hit us. So by themselves, data absolutely cannot tell us what's going to happen tomorrow. If they did, I'd be the first one to be sitting in the betting shops or at the lottery, sort of winning every single time it happened, because you could use this stuff, to try and get some sort of view into the future. Also beware trending. If you take a trend of data, so if I know that inflation is going up every single month and it's compounding itself and doubling every 4th month, I can extrapolate that and say that by the year 2025 inflation is going to be at 150%. Okay, but that's not necessarily true. And particularly with operational risk, where everything that we do is about people and people's conduct, we cannot assume that what happened previously is going to happen again in the future. So by itself, if I can see that I've got an increasing trend of fraud, if I don't do something about it, yes, in all likelihood, that trend will continue. But will it continue at the same speed, faster, slower, double, whatever? I really don't know. So a trend line, while it may give me a sort of an indication of where things might be going, it is not definitive, and you cannot use it as a predictive measure to say we will hit point X by this particular time point. Beware of trying to do that. I've seen a lot of people stand up in front of board risk committees and operational risk committees and sort of say, based on our metrics, that's where we're going to be in 6 months' time. 6 months later, they're sitting on the street looking for a new job, because obviously what they predicted never happened based on the historical data that they had. Basically, because your metrics are based on historical data, they tell you what has happened and currently where you stand. So if I have the number of open complaints, the complaints were made, so that is past tense, they're historic, they're lagging. But if they are open complaints, that gives me a measure of what I'm presently dealing with. And if I have both number and percentage, then I know that the percentage of complaints received in the last month that remain open is 50%. Well, that tells me I have got quite an issue to be dealing with if I don't want that number to get out of hand and become 60, 70, 80, 90%. Now, if you look at that measure, and if I can see, and this is where the trending comes in, that my number of open complaints is increasing month on month, and my total number of complaints is increasing month on month, there is a leading aspect to what this particular metric is telling me. It is telling me that unless I do something, the whole problem is just going to continue to increase in magnitude. So it may say to me, listen, guys, if you don't do something about this, you could end up with lawsuits. You could end up with regulatory investigations and inquiries. You could end up with a whole lot of things. You may not, so it's not predictive. It's not telling me when and where and how bad it's going to be, but it is saying to me there could be downstream problems if we don't start doing something about this. So, sit down and think of every single metric. If your metrics are purely looking at history, purely lagging, well, you need some sort of measure of what the current implications are. If you've got current information and you can trend it and you can express it as a percentage of and monitor the percentage change at a time, it does help you gain a bit of insight into the short-term future. Not long-term future, but short-term future. Now, I've got a...
Go on. So finish your point, Mike. I have a question on this slide, so before you move to the next slide, I'll ask the question. But finish your point, please.
Go for it. I'm about to move on to the next topic.
Oh, okay. This is a bit of medicine, right, Mike? Because in so many KRI projects, when organizations start developing indicators, of course, leading indicator, is the star that they're looking for. Okay, which indicator can give me that magic ball and allow me to see that if this indicator goes amber or red, I may have a loss event may happen in the next 1 week or in the next 1 month. But I can see your point that why that may not be very easy. And I'm also interpreting from what you're saying that indication about future is really on the interpretation that the indicator may not tell you. But if you understand the indicator and you interpret the indicator correctly, then your team or your organization may be able to get that little bit of foresight that, okay, if we don't fix this within the next 3 months, we're going to have big problems, coming in the near future. So I'm guessing it's not the indicator necessarily telling, hey, this is what is going to happen. Indicator is just telling you what has happened in the past, how things are today, and then it's the human interpretation. People who understand that indicator are the ones who have to make that judgment. Is that the correct way of interpreting what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to our motor vehicle and then the fuel gauge again. What you're traveling on a long trip, and you know that the next petrol station or fuel stop is in 50 kilometers time. I know my car's consumption level. I look at my gauge and I reckon I've got another 70 kilometers worth to go. I can make a decision. I'm going ahead till I get to that next fuel station. I don't know whether that fuel station has got fuel. I'm working on the assumption that it does. I'm working on the assumption that there's not going to be undue traffic or other delays which is going to cause me to use more fuel than what I'd normally use. So I'm taking certain decisions on the business environment within which I'm operating when I make my risk-based decisions. If I felt that it was a bit too uncomfortable to go that close to the wire, I might say to myself, well, there's a fuel station 20 kilometers behind me. I know that it had fuel because it was open when I came past it. So I may make a U-turn, go back and fill up. And in that way, I stay within a risk appetite that I've set for myself. And it's exactly the same thing. If you know that the number of customer complaints is getting out of hand, throw more effort at it, throw more people at it, try and identify what the root cause behind the complaints are to actually remove that. And in doing so, effectively, you've removed the need for the metric to be predictive because you've already taken action on the particular point.
Understood. Okay.
And again, I want to come back to my slide on providers and consumers. If the person who's doing the monitoring is the provider, they know that data already. Okay, they will be doing things on it. It's where the consumer is receiving the data in a contextual format that's important to them, that they can then make decisions on how best to manage that exposure. And that's why it's critical to separate those two roles.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
So let's move on. Thresholds. So what on earth are thresholds of escalation? Basically, predefined limits that when we get to certain points in our regular indicator reporting, if we reach that level, people get told about it. Now, there are all sorts of different types of them. I'm going to come on to them in a few months' time. But there's little point in having a metric and then not setting some sort of threshold on it. So if we think about our old friend customer complaints, if I'm quite happy to have 100 customer complaints, 1,000 customer complaints, 100,000 customer complaints, and I don't really worry about it. Simply tracking the number of open complaints is an exercise into futility. Because what's good, what's bad, when do we need to do something about it? So the critical thing to me is to set a variety of thresholds. So you may have an absolute number, which says that if our number of complaints reaches 100, I want the warnings to go out. You may set a sort of threshold that says if the number of open complaints exceeds 20% of total complaints received, I want alerts to go out. You may relate it to something else. So you may say if I have more than one complaint for every 10 customers that I actually have, I want the alarms to go off. So you can actually put context behind your thresholds that when they actually get triggered and when alerts and warnings are sounded, they actually have relevance to the people who are expected to respond to them. So think about a smoke detector in a building. If the smoke detector detects a level of carbon monoxide in the air, it may sound locally. If the levels reach above certain levels, other alarms may sound in local fire stations. If it gets beyond a further threshold, potentially a vast number of fire stations in the area or region get notified, and so you have a far greater response than what you would have in the first particular case. So we need to understand what it is that we're measuring in order to understand what sort of warnings and alerts we want to put on them. Now, your warnings and alerts that you put into place could be numeric. So it could be the number of, it could be a percentage of, it could be a monetary value, it could be a ratio of A to B, it could be a derived metric which says that if X number of days, minutes, and hours has passed since something previous happened, do the following. So you get all sorts of different types of mechanisms that you can use to build your thresholds on. But essentially, your alerts when they do go off will be one of 4 different types. The first and the most common type of threshold is what I refer to as a touch threshold. So let's go back to our staff turnover. We want to keep our staff turnover somewhere between, let's say, 2 and 5%. We want it to be above 2% because we want to keep some dead wood going out of the organization, but we want it to remain under 5% because more than that and our training budget's getting wasted and we're losing critical resources. So a touch threshold would mean that if at the end of August, I submit my staff turnover figures, if it touches or breaks 5%, or if it touches or breaks 2% on the lower side, the alarms go off. The moment it touches the threshold, off it goes. A repetitive touch threshold is used quite widely where you have very frequent collections of data, i.e. daily or weekly type collections of data. And what they actually try to do is say that the first time we touch the boundary, we don't set the alarms off there. But if in a second or a third or 5 sequential submissions of data, we are breaking the barriers, that's when the alarm goes off. So what it's really allowing is allowing management to actually address short-term fluctuations, or it's allowing local management time to respond to particular situations before actually escalating and raising it further up. Now, percentile breaches are quite an interesting one. And where these really come in is that, believe it or not, line 1 management like to play games with line 2. So we set a particular thing. The number of open customer complaints should not exceed 100. So guess what? Management sit there, gets up to 95, 96, whoops, better do something. They close a few out, goes back to 90, floats around there, back up to 96, 97, whoops, close a few out. So what they're really doing is they are aware where you've set the threshold, and they are managing to keep the number just below or just above the threshold that you've actually set. So a percentile breach would basically say, right, I'm now sitting underneath my 100 threshold. I'm setting a 10% variance, and if for more than 5 submissions, it's sitting within that variance boundary, the alarms go off. So essentially, the moment it gets for 5 sequential submissions above 90 of my 100, the alarm is going to go off even though you've not broken the 100. So it's just telling me where we're going. Trend thresholds have a number of purposes. If my staff turnover has gone from 3%, 3.5%, 4%, 4.5%, 5%, do I really need to wait for it to trigger my 5% threshold before I start taking action? So if I have, let's say, 6 sequential data submissions that are all increasing or decreasing or flat, I set the alarms off at that case. Flat thresholds are fantastic for catching people who just basically report the same number over and over and over again without actually telling you what the real numbers are. So these things can be used to help you police your actual reporting sort of process. Now, with the threshold, essentially what you want to do is to put in a tiered structure. So what you want to do is, coming back to our customer complaints, when it gets above 100, we've now gone from the green territory into the orange territory. And when I get to 125, it goes from the orange territory into the red territory. And if I get to 150, never mind going above red, what happens is a straight report to the board of directors saying this guy's not doing his job. Okay, so what you're basically doing is you're escalating to different groups of consumers and different groups of observers based on delegated authorities and based on the particular levels that are put into place within the organization. You can use red, amber, green. You may have 5 different sort of structures. You can have all sorts of structures that you want. Critical thing though, your threshold should never ever be absolute. You don't know what the starting point is. So customer complaints, if I have got 100 open complaints, is that actually good? Is that bad? Is it based on the budget and the resources applied to it? Does it feel about right? We don't know. We also need to know that there are cycles. So if I set my thresholds at a peak business point where we're more likely to have complaints than not, my threshold would be set much higher than if I set it at a very low business point where my number of complaints would be far lower. So you need to think about cycles. You need to think about correlations. And what you need to do is make sure that when we escalate them, they escalate in relation to the actual severity of what it is that we're actually measuring. Now, a few things about thresholds I just want to finish off on. First of all, don't start with a big bang. When you roll your KRI program out, I always recommend to people, monitor your metrics for a good 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Get to understand cycles. Get to understand where your values should actually be before you suddenly start putting thresholds in. If you suddenly start off with 50 different metrics, with 50 different thresholds, and management start receiving all these alerts and they're not fine-tuned, your whole program is dead because you've lost all credibility before you actually get to where you need to be. As I say, make sure you've got a feeling for where the metric is. Keep your thresholds quite open to start off with, and then tune them downwards. Bring them in, make them tighter and tighter as you get to understand the metric that you're actually tracking a lot closer. I've said it before, but use layer structures. And ensure that as you are escalating these things upwards, whatever you do, don't make it a surprise for the actual provider and consumer at the lowest level. There's nothing worse than somebody suddenly getting an alert, walking in and saying, why is your metric broke this threshold? And as far as you're concerned, there's actually no risk. It's really not a nice thing to have to deal with. And the last point on thresholds, they've got to be revised from time to time. So just like you should be reviewing your KRIs that you're actually tracking to make sure they represent the risks and the controls that you've actually got in place and that you're actually concerned about, so you should be reviewing your thresholds to ensure that they're not too wide and that basically people aren't just managing exposure under those thresholds to prevent themselves looking bad from a management perspective. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where we are. I'll summarize in a few points before handing back to Manoj, who might have a few questions. I've said it before, there's no such thing as a top 10 set of metrics. There are no predictive indicators by themselves. You'll have a lot of players in your actual program. So, consumers, providers, the actual people who are actually developing the metrics themselves, as well as the observers. The risk profile changes all the time. Causal factors change all the time. So therefore, your metric set should change all the time as well. If you can link your KRIs and your other metrics to causal factors, you'll become more proactive than if you're sitting and linking them purely to previously identified risks. Just set it, but revise your thresholds regularly, continuously monitor your exposure. And lastly, and unfortunately, don't expect instant gratification from your KRI program. The benefits of the program will take time to manifest itself. So when you're going up with your cost-benefit analysis and getting people to buy into the program, don't say to them, we're going to reduce our risk instantaneously, because you're not. It takes time to read the entrails of what the metrics are telling you and to make sense of them. Manoj.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Thank you. So we have come to the end of the hour, but I do have a couple of questions, Mike. So are you okay to stay for another 5 minutes to just answer a couple of questions?
I absolutely am.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So I think one question is on which operational risk should be addressed more as part of the KRI program. So the options in the question are people, process, or system. So I'm guessing it is easy to have indicators around systems and processes, but probably difficult to have indicators around people. What's your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Your pure people-related metrics tend to be a bit more of the soft and fluffy type of things. They need to be put into context, so therefore they're quite difficult to actually pull together. And it's probably easier to actually have metrics around external factors than it is around some of the people-related issues. I'd agree with that.
Okay, excellent. And there are questions about the PowerPoint slides today and the recording. So they will be available in the membership area on the IOR website. So if you are an IOR member, then you should be able to get access to the slides and recording there, and it's only a membership privilege, the recording and the slides. So we won't be able to share the slides with you if you are not a IOR member currently. So with that, let me just take the sharing access. So I'll just summarize, and we'll finish with the last slide. So thank you very much, Mike, for sharing some guidance. I think there are some good pointers there. Difficult to have predictive or leading indicators. I think that was the good one for me. And then the 2 or 3 different types of thresholds you mentioned, because I had seen more examples of touch and absolute values. But it was interesting to see that you shared examples of there are other type of thresholds also. Which can be used. So there were some good pointers for me, which of course I'm going to use in my work environment. So thank you very much for coming and sharing this great guidance. Thank you to all the attendees for coming and participating in this webinar. We are looking for new topics now to plan more webinar topics over the next 6 to 12 months. So if there is a particular topic you are interested in, then I'm sharing my email ID on the screen here. So please do send me your ideas, and then depending on the ideas, we'll try to get hold of the right expert and organize the webinar on those topics. So you will see more webinar topics being published on IOR website in the next 2 to 3 weeks, where we're creating a calendar for the next 6 months. So we're planning to organize one webinar every 4 to 6 weeks. So there is an element of continuous learning as part of these webinars. Yeah. So that's all I had today. Thank you very much, Mike, again. Thank you to all the participants. See you again in another IOR webinar in the very near future. Thank you.